Welcome to Books and More Audio. Today, we dive into A Little History of Economics by Niall Kishtainy, a fascinating journey through thousands of years of human thought about wealth, work, and society. From the wisdom of ancient Greece to Adam Smith's invisible hand, from Marx's revolution to the challenges of globalization, this book reveals that economics is not just about money, it's about people, power, and purpose. It shows how every choice we make shapes the world we live in. So, sit back, relax, and let's explore how economics tells the story of life itself. From life philosophy to economics philosophy. Economics, from its very beginning, has never been just about numbers or charts. It's a story about human beings, how we live, choose, and strive for a better life. The first part of A Little History of Economics unfolds like a journey through time, from the questions of ancient Greek philosophers to the first thinkers who laid the foundations for modern economic reasoning. These 5 chapters reveal the birth of a discipline born not from cold calculation, but from the union of intellect, ethics, and compassion. It begins with a cool head and a warm heart, where economics emerges as a new way of seeing scarcity, the challenge of living well in a world of limited resources. As Lionel Robbins said, economics is the art of choice, of deciding between a hospital and a football stadium, a new watch, or a full meal. Yet what makes economics profound is not only logic, but empathy. Alfred Marshall believed that a true economist needs both a cool head to analyze and a warm heart to understand suffering. Economics, therefore, is not a science of money, but a science of humanity, rational and emotional, rigorous yet compassionate. From there, the swans take flight brings us back to ancient Greece, where Plato and Aristotle first asked, where does wealth come from and what makes a just society? Plato envisioned an ideal city where people lived for the common good rather than personal gain. Aristotle, more pragmatic, accepted that wealth was necessary, but warned against greed. He distinguished natural wealth, meant to satisfy real needs, from unnatural wealth born of endless accumulation. He also explored the role of money, not as an idol, but as a tool to facilitate exchange. In their reflections, we see that economics was born not from commerce, but from moral inquiry. Then came the economy of God, when Christianity spread across Europe. Thinkers like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas examined wealth and labor through the lens of faith. Work, they believed, was both a punishment for sin and a path to redemption. In the medieval world, riches were viewed as gifts from God, but the love of money was condemned as a sin. Aquinas emphasized the idea of a just price, a price rooted in honesty and fairness, not mere profit. He fiercely opposed usury, declaring that money cannot breed money. For centuries, this moral vision shaped Europe's view of commerce and fairness. History then moves to In Search of Gold, the age of mercantilism, when European powers set sail to conquer and trade. Gold became the measure of national strength, and wealth was seen as finite, something to be hoarded. Figures like Thomas Munn and Gerard de Milanis argued that a nation prospers by exporting more than it imports, keeping gold within its borders. It was a time of protectionism, empire, and exploitation, but also the dawn of global trade, the first glimpse of what would become a world economy. Finally, nature's reward transports us to 18th century France, where the physiocrats, led by François Quesnay and Turgot, believed that true wealth came from the land. To them, agriculture was the only productive sector. Commerce and industry merely redistributed value. Quesnay's tableau économique depicted the circulation of wealth like the flow of blood in a living body, an early attempt to model the economy as a system. Although they underestimated the power of industry, their idea of natural order paved the way for future economic thought, that the economy, like nature, has its own rules which humans must understand rather than resist. These first 5 chapters invite us into the origins of economic thought, a world where philosophy, theology, and daily life intertwine. From Aristotle to Keynes, humanity has wrestled with questions of value, fairness, and survival. Economics was born as a mirror of society, a way to understand the world and a hope that through knowledge and compassion, we might build a better one. Part 2. The Invisible Hand and the Engine of Capitalism. While the first part of the story told of the moral and philosophical roots of economics, this second part marks the moment when economics steps out of theology's shadow and becomes an independent science. Here, the great thinkers, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and Karl Marx, reshape how humanity understands wealth, labor, and power. These 5 chapters trace the birth of classical economics and the rise of capitalism, where human ambition and inequality grow side by side. It begins with the invisible hand, the symbol of Adam Smith's vision. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that when individuals pursue their own interests, they unintentionally promote the common good, as if guided by an invisible hand. To him, the market was a self-regulating mechanism in which supply, demand, and price naturally found balance. Wealth, Smith said, did not come from gold or land, but from labor and specialization. The division of labor multiplied productivity, and voluntary exchange bound people together in mutual benefit. He saw freedom not as chaos, but as order born of human cooperation. Smith thus laid the foundation for modern capitalism, a system fueled by self-interest yet capable of creating collective prosperity. Then comes Corn Meets Iron, where David Ricardo transforms Smith's insights into mathematical precision. Ricardo viewed the economy as a machine driven by the interaction of classes: landlords, capitalists, and workers. He formulated the law of diminishing returns, showing how as land becomes scarce, rents rise while profits fall. He also introduced the theory of comparative advantage, proving that even nations less productive in every field can still benefit from trade by specializing in what they do best. Ricardo's logic was cold but clear. Trade and competition, not protectionism, create wealth. His work turned economics into a discipline of laws and equations, beautiful in its simplicity, yet indifferent to human suffering. In An Ideal World, the tone shifts from logic to hope. Thinkers like St. Simon and Robert Owen dreamt of reorganizing society around cooperation instead of competition. They imagined communities where workers shared ownership and no one lived in deprivation. Their visions were dismissed as utopian, but they revealed a yearning for justice within the industrial age. Factories and machines had made nations rich, but also enslaved laborers to endless toil. The question now was not how to create wealth, but how to share it. That leads naturally to Too Many Mouths to Feed, the grim prophecy of Thomas Malthus. In his view, population grows faster than food supply, and unless checked by famine, disease, or moral restraint, humanity would sink into poverty. His ideas cast a shadow over the optimism of his time. For Malthus, poverty was not a failure of society, but an inevitable law of nature. While cruel, his insight laid the groundwork for later studies of resources, growth, and sustainability, questions that still haunt modern economics. Finally comes Workers of the World, where Karl Marx steps onto the stage. Building on and rebelling against the ideas of Smith and Ricardo, Marx saw capitalism as both creative and destructive, a system that generates immense wealth by exploiting those who produce it. He introduced the concept of surplus value, the difference between what workers create and what they are paid, which becomes profit for the capitalist. For Marx, capitalism was a dynamic but doomed system, destined to collapse under its own contradictions. His Communist Manifesto became a rallying cry for the working class and a challenge to the moral legitimacy of free markets. Part 2 ends with 2 opposing hands shaping history: Adam Smith's invisible hand of freedom and Karl Marx's iron hand of revolution. Between them lies the truth of the modern economy, where reason drives progress, but inequality and conflict never disappear. Economics, now a science, has grown powerful enough to explain the world and dangerous enough to change it. Part 3. Between Reason and Chaos. After the rise of capitalism and the great clash between Smith's optimism and Marx's revolution, economics entered a new age, one obsessed with equilibrium, prediction, and control. The third part of A Little History of Economics tells the story of how thinkers tried to transform the chaos of real life into the order of mathematics, and how every attempt to find perfect balance eventually collided with the unpredictable nature of human behavior. It is the age when economics became modern, scientific, ambitious, and sometimes dangerously confident. It begins with perfect balance, the dream of the late 19th century. Economists like Leon Walras and Alfred Marshall imagined the market as a delicate machine in which every force, supply, demand, wages, and profits moved toward harmony. Prices acted like signals that guided millions of individual decisions into a state of collective balance. The economy, they believed, was a self-regulating organism. It was an era of faith in reason. If one could measure and model everything, stability and prosperity would follow. But the world soon proved otherwise. Then came darkening skies, when the Great Depression shattered that dream. The collapse of 1929 destroyed jobs, savings, and the belief that markets could heal themselves. Out of this despair rose John Maynard Keynes, the man who redefined the relationship between government and the economy. Keynes saw that people are not always rational. They are ruled by fear, hope, and herd mentality. When businesses stop investing and citizens stop spending, only the state can intervene to restore confidence. He urged governments to spend during recessions and save during booms, turning public policy into a tool for economic stability. Keynesianism became the new gospel of recovery and full employment. Profit from war shows how this theory became reality. The world wars, though catastrophic, transformed economies into engines of production and innovation. Governments mobilized factories, resources, and people with unprecedented efficiency. Economics became planners and advisors, helping design systems that would rebuild nations. After the wars, Keynes's ideas inspired the welfare state and the long post-war boom known as the Golden Age. Economics was no longer a passive science. It had become an instrument of power, capable of steering the destiny of entire countries. Yet harmony was short-lived. The noisy trumpet player symbolizes the growing tension between order and creativity. Joseph Schumpeter argued that capitalism thrives not because it is stable, but because it is restless. Innovation, he said, is creative destruction. Each new idea destroys the old. Each breakthrough creates turmoil before progress. The entrepreneur became the hero of modern economics, the one who dares to disrupt. Schumpeter admired capitalism's vitality but foresaw its downfall. Once corporations grew too large, innovation would wither and bureaucracy would take over. His vision was both a celebration and a warning about the system's self-destructive energy. Finally, Coca or Pepsi captures a world where competition shifts from factories to feelings. When products became similar and markets saturated, companies learned to sell emotions instead of goods, identity, status, belonging. Economics, once about material needs, entered the realm of psychology and marketing. Consumers no longer bought with reason, but with desire. This was the birth of behavioral economics long before it had a name, a recognition that human choices cannot be explained by logic alone. Part 3 closes with a humbling realization. The economy is not a machine, and people are not equations. For every model of balance, there is a shock. For every law of reason, an outbreak of chaos. Yet within that tension lies the soul of economics, a science forever caught between what can be calculated and what can only be felt. Part 4. When the state enters the market. After the Second World War, the world emerged from ruins with a new faith in reason and organization. Economists and politicians believed they could finally design prosperity, control inflation, eliminate unemployment, and plan a future of stability. Part 4 of A Little History of Economics tells the story of this grand experiment, how governments took the steering wheel of the economy and how that power later slipped from their hands. It is the era of Keynesian triumph, the birth of modern macroeconomics, and the inevitable backlash that followed. It begins with The Man with a Plan, a portrait of John Maynard Keynes, the architect of modern economic policy. Before Keynes, most economists believed that markets naturally returned to balance and that recessions were temporary. But the Great Depression shattered that illusion. Keynes argued that when people stop spending and businesses stop investing, the market will not fix itself. Only government spending on public works, jobs, and welfare can revive demand. His theory turned the state into an active player, the doctor of the capitalist system. Through fiscal policy, governments learned not just to react to crises, but to prevent them. The post-war decades became the golden age of Keynesian economics, a time of growth, jobs, and optimism. Then comes the glamour of money. As the world grew richer, attention shifted from production to finance. Milton Friedman, a leading figure of the monetarist school, challenged Keynesian ideas. He claimed that the key to stability was not government spending, but control over the money supply. Too much money in circulation, he warned, would always lead to inflation. Friedman believed that the economy was best left to the discipline of markets, and that central banks should follow clear, limited rules. His vision of free markets and small government became the foundation of neoliberalism. The debate between Keynes and Friedman, the balance between intervention and freedom, defined the second half of the 20th century. The Whole of Consumption explores the paradox of abundance. As consumer culture exploded, economist John Kenneth Galbraith saw a society drowning in products but starving for purpose. He argued that corporations manipulate desire, creating artificial needs to fuel endless consumption. The result was a rich world with crumbling public services and eroding community life. Galbraith urged governments to redirect wealth toward education, infrastructure, and equality. His critique was not against prosperity itself, but against its blindness. A call to remember that growth should serve humanity, not the other way around. In Creative Destruction, Joseph Schumpeter returns with his powerful metaphor of capitalism as a living, self-destructive organism. Innovation, he said, is both a blessing and a curse. Every invention, steam engines, electricity, computers, destroys the old order and gives birth to the new. Entrepreneurs are the true heroes of progress, but their success also breeds monopolies that stifle creativity. Schumpeter's insight captured the restless pulse of modern capitalism. Progress demands sacrifice, and no system can remain stable forever. The section ends with The Prisoner's Dilemma, a concept that reshaped how economists understood cooperation and conflict. Two prisoners are questioned separately. If both stay silent, they receive light sentences. If one betrays, he goes free while the other suffers. Rational self-interest pushes them to betray each other, even though cooperation would be better for both. John Nash and other game theorists used this logic to explain markets, politics, and war, showing that in a world of competition, trust is fragile but essential. The dilemma revealed that pure self-interest does not always lead to the common good, a quiet challenge to the legacy of Adam Smith. Part 4 closes with a sobering truth. Neither the state nor the market can rule alone. The economy is not a machine that can be programmed, but a living system shaped by choices, incentives, and emotions. The dream of perfect control faded, leaving behind a deeper wisdom. That prosperity requires both freedom and responsibility, both logic and humanity. Part 5. From Nations to the World. After the golden age of Keynesian economics, the mid-20th century brought a new question that would define global politics. If some nations could achieve prosperity, why couldn't others? Part 5 of A Little History of Economics traces humanity's struggle to create shared development, from the optimism of post-war planning to the sobering reality of global inequality. It is a story of ambition, dependency, and the limits of economic theory when faced with the power of history and politics. It begins with The Tyranny of Government, a reflection on the growing belief that the state could design prosperity. In the decades after World War II, many countries adopted central planning, convinced that economic growth could be engineered from above. Yet critics such as Friedrich Hayek warned that too much control would suffocate freedom and innovation. He argued that the economy was too complex to be managed by any bureaucracy, that spontaneous order, not command, was the true source of progress. Thus began the tension between planning and liberty, between the promise of equality and the danger of control. Next comes the big push, a phrase that captured the spirit of the 1950s and 60s, when economists believed poor nations could leap forward with enough investment and ambition. Paul Rosenstein-Rodin and W. Arthur Lewis envisioned grand industrial projects, infrastructure, and education systems that could trigger self-sustaining growth. Lewis described the dual economy, a traditional rural sector with surplus labor and a modern industrial one that could absorb it. If governments invested wisely, he said, productivity would rise and poverty would fade. It was an era of optimism. Development seemed only a matter of planning and will. But reality proved harsher. Many of these big pushes left countries in debt, corruption, and disappointment. In The Economics of Everything, the reach of economics expanded beyond factories and trade to every corner of human life. Thinkers such as Gary Becker applied economic logic to marriage, crime, education, and family decisions. Every choice, he said, could be understood through costs and benefits. While his ideas revealed the power of rational analysis, critics feared that economics was losing its soul, that by turning all behavior into numbers, it forgot the moral and cultural dimensions of life. Growing up shifts the focus to technology and long-term progress. Robert Solow's growth model showed that innovation, more than labor or capital, drives prosperity. Yet even as economies grew, inequality deepened. The rich world advanced rapidly, while poorer nations struggled to keep pace. Growth, it seemed, did not guarantee happiness or justice. As global trade expanded, many developing countries found themselves trapped in cycles of debt and dependency, chasing the prosperity of the West without ever catching it. Finally, The Sweet Harmony examines the fading dream of global balance. Economists like Andre Gunder Frank and Raoul Prebisch challenged the optimism of free trade, arguing that the global system favored the wealthy center at the expense of the poor periphery. The so-called dependency theory claimed that the development of rich nations relied on the underdevelopment of others. Even as globalization promised harmony, it deepened inequality, a melody that sounded sweet but left many unheard. Part 5 ends with a hard-won lesson. Development is not just about economics, but about power, history, and justice. The global market binds humanity together, yet it also divides. And while growth remains the modern god, it raises an ancient question. Can prosperity ever be truly shared, or will wealth always flow toward those who already have it? Part 6. The Illusions of Freedom. After decades of faith in progress and globalization, the late 20th century revealed a painful truth. Freedom in the market can also create new chains. Part 6 of A Little History of Economics tells the story of how the world's pursuit of economic freedom led to crisis, inequality, and self-doubt. It is a chronicle of rising hopes and shattered illusions, a time when the market became both savior and destroyer. It begins with a divided world, where the planet splits into two rival systems, capitalism in the West and socialism in the East. The Cold War was not only a military contest, but also an ideological battle about how to organize economies and societies. Central planning promised equality but stifled creativity. Free markets fostered innovation but bred inequality. Both sides were driven by faith in their own perfection. Yet as decades passed, cracks began to show. Planned economies grew rigid, while capitalist nations wrestled with inflation and discontent. Humanity discovered that no system could claim absolute truth. Then comes filling the bathtub, an image for the turbulent economy of the 1970s. Oil crises, rising prices, and stagnation left policymakers helpless. Keynesian spending, once the cure for recession, now only fed inflation. Economists like Milton Friedman and the monetarists argued that governments had gone too far, that pouring money into the system only made the bathtub overflow. They insisted that the economy needed discipline, stable money, limited state power, and trust in market forces. Their message resonated in a world weary of bureaucracy, paving the way for a new faith in free markets and the ideology of neoliberalism. Led by Clowns paints a satirical yet tragic picture of the political turn that followed. In the 1980s, leaders such as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher embraced the creed of deregulation, privatization, and tax cuts. "The government is the problem," Reagan declared. At first, the results seemed miraculous. Inflation fell, markets soared, and confidence returned. But beneath the surface, inequality widened and public welfare eroded. The clowns here are not fools but performers, leaders who turned economic policy into theater, masking the social cost of their revolution. Their legacy was a world more dynamic yet more divided than ever. Next, The Money Illusion explores the era when finance replaced production as the engine of capitalism. Banks and traders turned risk into profit, creating layers of speculation far removed from the real economy. The efficient market hypothesis proclaimed that prices always reflected all available information, that markets were rational, self-correcting, and wise. But behind the elegance of equations lay human greed, fear, and self-deception. As bubbles grew and burst, the illusion of perfect markets collapsed. The economy, once driven by work and innovation, now revolved around credit and hope, fragile things that vanish overnight. Then, looking to the future reflects the soul-searching that followed. Economists began to ask new questions. What if people aren't rational? What if endless growth destroys the planet? What if happiness, not GDP, should be our measure of success? From behavioral economics to environmental and development studies, the field began to rediscover its human heart. The goal was no longer to predict the future perfectly, but to understand it humbly and to shape it wisely. Part 6 ends with a realization both sobering and hopeful. Economic freedom brought prosperity, but also imbalance. The market, left alone, could not guarantee fairness or meaning. True freedom, the author suggests, is not the absence of control, it is the presence of wisdom. Economics, at its best, must not only count profits, but also confront the illusions that wealth creates. Part 7. The Limits of Reason. After centuries of believing that humans are rational and predictable, economics finally faced its greatest revelation, that people are emotional, inconsistent, and profoundly human. Part 7 of A Little History of Economics marks a turning point where the discipline turns its gaze inward, from the grand systems of markets and nations to the intricate world of the human mind. This is the era of behavioral economics, when economists learned that understanding the economy means first understanding ourselves. It begins with the fall of the rational man. For generations, economists assumed that people act logically, always choosing what maximizes their benefit. But psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky shattered that illusion. Through experiments and data, they showed that people are guided by biases and emotions, overestimating small risks, fearing losses more than valuing gains, and often choosing instinctively rather than logically. The economic man of theory, calm, calculating, and precise, was replaced by the real human being, anxious, impulsive, and deeply imperfect. Then comes the psychologists in the trading room. Financial markets, long thought to be driven by rational expectations, turned out to be arenas of collective emotion. Richard Thaler and others demonstrated that investors often act irrationally, driven by herd behavior, greed, and fear. Booms and crashes are not anomalies, but natural products of human psychology. Thaler argued that markets are not efficient reflections of truth. They are mirrors of our hopes and delusions. In recognizing this, economics became more honest, embracing the chaos it had once tried to ignore. In The Stick and the Carrot, economists began to explore how small nudges could guide people toward better decisions without restricting freedom. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein proposed that governments and institutions could design choices in smarter ways, for example, making retirement savings automatic or placing healthy foods at eye level in cafeterias. This approach, called libertarian paternalism, respected human freedom while acknowledging human weakness. It was a quiet revolution, policy informed not by ideology, but by empathy and psychology. The world of foolish decisions widens this insight to everyday life. From buying a lottery ticket to procrastinating on work, humans consistently make choices that defy logic. These mistakes, however, are not mere flaws. They are windows into how people truly think and feel. By studying them, economics began to reconnect with life as it is actually lived. It stopped being the science of perfection and became the science of reality, messy, unpredictable, and deeply human. Finally, when emotions become data, captures the new frontier. Economists started to measure happiness, well-being, and social connection alongside income and output. Scholars like Paul Dolan asked, what really makes us flourish? The answer was not more consumption, but meaning, belonging, and emotional security. Economics began to rediscover its moral purpose, not just to increase wealth, but to improve lives. Part 7 closes on a quiet yet profound realization. Reason alone cannot explain the human story. Behind every price, every choice, and every market lies a beating heart. The true challenge of economics is not to eliminate emotion, but to understand it. Because only when we see people as they are, not as we wish them to be, can we hope to build an economy that serves humanity. Part 8. Economics in a New Era. As humanity entered the 21st century, it carried both the wisdom and the wounds of the past. The world had grown richer, faster, and more connected than ever before, yet also more fragile and uncertain. Part 8 of A Little History of Economics looks at this modern age, where globalization, technology, and climate change challenge the very purpose of economics. It is the story of a discipline rediscovering its conscience, seeking meaning in an age ruled by data, finance, and algorithms. It opens with economics in the real world, where theory collides with reality. The global financial crisis of 2008 exposed the limits of elegant models and blind faith in markets. Complex financial products, supposedly safe, collapsed overnight, plunging millions into unemployment and despair. Economists, once seen as the guardians of prosperity, faced a reckoning. How could they have missed the storm? The crisis forced the field to step down from its pedestal and confront life as it is, unpredictable, emotional, and deeply human. Economics had to return to its original question: how can we create a world that works for everyone? Then comes The Excited Bankers, a cautionary tale about the intoxication of money and power. Banks and financial institutions, fueled by greed and mathematical arrogance, built a system that seemed unstoppable, until it wasn't. The pursuit of endless profit turned finance into a casino where risk was hidden and responsibility forgotten. When the bubble burst, ordinary people bore the pain. This chapter is not just an indictment of capitalism's excesses, but a reminder that morality, not mathematics, must anchor the economy. In Giants in the Sky, the focus shifts to the rise of technology empires, companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook that now shape not only markets, but also human behavior. Data has become the new gold, algorithms the new rulers. These digital giants know what we want before we do, guiding our choices with invisible precision. The question of ownership has changed. It's no longer about who controls factories, but who controls information. Economics must now grapple with issues of privacy, power, and the ethics of artificial intelligence, challenges far beyond the imagination of Adam Smith or Karl Marx. The Vanished Women brings gender into the center of economic thought. For centuries, women's labor, both paid and unpaid, was ignored or undervalued. But modern economists like Amartya Sen and Esther Duflo have shown that empowering women is not just a moral issue, but an economic necessity. When women have access to education, healthcare, and decision-making, entire societies grow stronger and more prosperous. The invisible half of the economy finally steps into the light, reminding us that true progress must include everyone. Finally, Why You Should Be an Economist closes the book with a hopeful invitation. To study economics is not merely to learn about money or markets, but to understand the human story, the trade-offs, ambitions, and moral choices that shape our lives. In a world of uncertainty, economics offers a compass, not a map. It teaches us how to think critically, act responsibly, and imagine new possibilities for the future. Part 8 and the book end with a gentle truth. Economics is not the science of wealth, but the science of life. From ancient philosophers to modern data scientists, the quest has always been the same: to understand how people can live together, prosper, and care for one another. The new era of economics, therefore, is not about predicting the future, but about shaping it with wisdom, compassion, and humanity.